Welcome to this second session on the topic of integrating the management of operational risk into core business processes. This is second of the three workshops Risk Spotlight is organizing on this topic. I am Manoj Khalwal and I will be the facilitator for this session. I am co-founder and Chief Risk Officer at Risk Spotlight. I'm very passionate about utilizing risk management as a management tool to define and execute business strategy. So that is one of the key areas of research for me and also engagements with clients in UK and outside UK. I was part of the UK delegation, which participated in the revision of the ISO 31000 standard. So for those not familiar with ISO 31000, it is a international standard on risk management published by ISO. I was also member of the IOR project team for developing and rolling out Certificate of Operational Risk Management, which some of you may be familiar with. I was also part of the team which designed the world's first forward-looking operational risk content service called Risk Spotlight Portal, which is utilized by over 100 financial services firms for horizon scanning and monitoring emerging operational risk topics. Some of you may already subscribe to this service. Some of you are participating in the free trial of this service at the moment. If you have not looked at the service, then I strongly recommend, if you are interested in monitoring emerging operational risk topics and incident, then you can sign up for a free 2 months trial from the Risk Spotlight website, which is at www.riskspotlight.com. I have trained over 1,000 operational risk professionals through classroom and online courses, and I've given the link to my LinkedIn profile in case you want to connect with me or you want to monitor the various operational risk updates I regularly publish on LinkedIn. And if you want to run this workshop for your internal stakeholders, then I've also given you my email ID, so you can contact me if you want to organize a version of this workshop for your internal stakeholders where we can customize some of the examples from this course specific to your organization. We also want to announce our next series of workshop, which will be on the topic of operational resilience. These workshops will be organized on 14th and 21st May, and they will be focused on the implementation tool and practices aspects of operational resilience. And they will particularly focus on the operational resilience regulatory guidance published by FCA and PRA in UK. If that is something your organization is interested in, then do consider registering for this workshop at www.riskspotlight.com/opresilience. So before we start new content, I just wanted to take some time to summarize some of the key topics we covered in the first session in February. So one of the topics we started off in the first session was highlighting how operational risk practices have failed over the last 12 to 15 years to get buy-in from first line in most financial services firms. And there are various reasons we covered in the first session. And the idea of these workshops is to present some new ideas organizations can try to improve the buy-in from the first line in terms of participation on management of operational risk. One of the ideas we explored in the first session was utilizing the term managing operational risk when interacting with the first line instead of the term operational risk management. This is a small difference, but it can have a positive impact if used consistently over a period of time. And this is because managing operational risk is an activity. It is associated with a verb. It's something you do, which is what we want first line to engage in. And operational risk management term is typically perceived to as a department in the first line. So if we use the term operational risk management, then the first line may perceive that, okay, that is something which is associated with the group operational risk management department rather than something which they need to do. So it is a subtle difference in the use of language, but I have found from experience that if used consistently over a period of time, it can create that ownership on managing operational risk within the first line. Another topic we covered in the first session was how we can raise awareness within the first line that risks are integral part of successfully defining strategy, executing that strategy, making key business decisions, and managing the day-to-day activities within the organization. So risks don't need to be managed just because we have a risk management department. Risks need to be managed because they are integral part of what the first line is already doing on a day-to-day basis. And we need some good visual tools to be able to communicate that. And we shared some of these tools in the first session. So if you're interested in exploring more around those tools, then please do look at the recording of the first session. Another idea we explored in the first session was start utilizing the terms value creation and value protection as critical components for achieving firms' business objectives. So everything which is being done in any organization can be easily categorized into either a value creation activity or a value protection activities. And if that language is used, then it becomes very easy for the first line to understand the importance of risk management, because risk management can be a part of both value creation as well as value protection, and both are equally important for an organization to be successful. So an organization cannot just focus on value creation and completely ignore value protection. Similarly, an organization cannot just focus on value protection; they also need to focus on value creation. So achieving business objectives in a consistent way over a long period of time requires an organization to equally focus on value creation and value protection. And if we start using that language with the first line, then they will be able to easily see how risks are part of both of those aspects of their daily activities. And again, there's more details we covered in the first session, so please do watch the recording if you want to explore that further. And the last topic, which we started covering in the first session and will continue in this session, was how do we align organization's objective to personal objectives, and how do we structure the compensation to create that alignment between the organization and personal objectives. So I'll cover some of the slides we covered in the first session, but at a high level. So we had covered this example where we had taken an example. So in this case, it's a fictitious bank called RWS Bank, a simple organization hierarchy where they have a retail bank, insurance, bank division, and then there's the central corporate functions. So in this case, if the bank had one objective of increasing revenue by 15% at the group level, then to achieve that objective, they may cascade down the objective across the retail bank and insurance business unit. So in this case, the objective for retail bank would be to increase the revenue by 18%. So if they achieve that, then that will help organization achieve its overall group level objective of increasing revenue by 15%. And then the head of retail bank may cascade down that objective. So where if they have retail banking and credit card as two separate business units within retail bank, then a objective of increasing revenue by 16% may be given to the retail bank, and then credit card, the head of credit card will get his or her own objective. And then the objective may be cascaded down where for the sales team, the revenue objective would be cascaded down to the head of sales within the retail bank. And within the sales team, if there is branch-based sales team and there is online sales team, then that objective may be cascaded down that the online sales team need to achieve a revenue increase of 25%. So this is one sort of common way in how objectives at the group level may be cascaded down. And the reason this is important is this is what the first line care about when they come into work every day. They don't come into work every day to manage operational risk or to comply with regulatory obligation. They're coming into work to achieve these business objectives. So it is important that whatever we do from a operational risk management perspective, it's aligned with the objectives. So if this would be an example of how objectives are cascaded down, then what a organization may do next is align those business objectives with the individual objectives for different executives at different levels within the organization, and their individual compensations may also be aligned with those objectives. So in this case, we're saying the increased revenue by 16% objective will get assigned to the head of retail banking. So she will become the owner of that particular objective, and it'll also become a personal objective on which she will be measured on. And then we're using a simple example in this case, just to keep it easy, where the compensation of the head of retail banking may be aligned with that particular objective. So if her business unit is able to achieve a revenue increase of 14 to 16%, she gets £250,000 of bonus. If she gets revenue is about 16%, she gets 300,000. If the increase is between 10 and 13%, she gets £50,000 as bonus. And if the revenue increase is less than 10%, then she would not get any bonus. So again, a very simple example. In real life, there will be lots of variables which will determine personal compensation of a executive or a manager in different parts of the organization. But the idea is we are aligning the company objective to the individuals, and then we're giving individuals the motivation on doing the right things so that they are motivated on a day-to-day basis. That if they then do the right things, then that'll help the organization achieve their objectives. So in some cases, it may be easy to align the company objective with the personal objective, but in some cases that may not be easy. So in this case, if we have head of IT, then we cannot directly align the increase in revenue objective to the head of IT. So what we may have to come up with, other business indicators or other business metrics which can be influenced and managed by the head of IT, but which would support the achievement of that business objective. So in this case, we may determine that the total outage of the online banking system would be one key driver, which is in the influence of the head of IT. So we can derive the compensation based on the disruption to the online banking system. So if there is 15 to 30-minute disruption to the online banking system during a year, the bonus for the head of IT would be £75,000. If the disruption over the year is 1 to 14 minutes, they get £100,000 as bonus. If they get £150,000 bonus if there are no outages in a year. And then no bonus if the outages over the year, if they go about 30 minutes. And that gives then the head of IT the incentive to go and allocate their budget and capital and go and manage the risk, invest in controls to ensure that the outages stay within the defined limits. And the head of IT then also has a personal incentive in this case to make sure the outages are minimized. And if that are minimized, then in this case, we're making the assumption that that'll help the retail bank achieve their revenue objective. So we may have to align then the company objectives to certain metrics which are within the scope of a particular department if they don't have direct influence on that business objective. So once that is done, then each head of business unit or department or head of a team, they can then go and decide how they want to allocate the budget. So each head of a team, head of department, may be given a certain level of budget, and they need to now decide how are they going to invest that in value creation activities, how are they going to invest that in the value protection activities. And the investment may go in defining or creating new processes or upgrading existing manual processes and automating them so that they become more efficient. The risks may be minimized around those processes, or they may invest in people, or they may invest in getting tangible asset or intangible asset. So that's the decision which is being made by a head of a team, a head of a department, a head of a business unit, a head of a business division, and based on how they allocate is what will then drive how risks are managed on the day-to-day basis. So in this case, there are a few bullet points, so I'll sort of expand some of those. So in this case, the head of retail banking may allocate resources, yeah, between the value creation, value protection activity, and the objective would be to get the right balance so that the likelihood of achieving that strategic objective which is assigned to her is increased. Yeah, and that sort of is what differentiates that how executives balance or how executives distribute the budget between value creation and value protection activity. That sort of drives whether those executives will be successful over the long term or not. So if they are constantly, if they're investing 90% of the budget on value creation activity and only 10% on value protection, then they may be lucky in the short term, but over the long term they will not be successful. So only executives who are able to find that right balance between value creation and value protection will be successful in the long run. And then this immediately then gives each head of the business unit the inherent motivation that they will manage the risk, because if they don't manage the risk, they will not be able to achieve the objectives, and then those objectives are aligned with their personal compensation. So we've tied everything together to create enough motivation for them to adequately invest between value creation and value protection, but they may not be aware of this, and that's what the second line team needs to do, is make them aware of how they are dividing the budget between value creation and value protection, because they may not be familiar with these terms. So one of the things we need to do is increase the usage of those terms, value creation and value protection, so that they see that a balance of both is needed. And if they manage both of those, they will manage the business better, and they will manage the risks inherently as part of finding a good balance between value creation and value protection. And then we need to focus on the language. So now each head of the business unit, if they're not familiar with the OPRIS terminology, and then they may be using different words, for the risk. So one head of the business unit may be calling risks as threats. One head of business unit may be calling risks as issues. And that's where it's the role of the group operational risk team is to make sure that you publish some standard terms, so standard language, so that when the term issue is used between two different business units, then it means the same thing. If the word incident is used between two different teams, then it means the same thing. Otherwise, each senior executive or each manager or head of the department, they may use different terms, and then when meetings happen, lots of acronyms or words may be used, but they may be used in very different contexts. Yeah. And then also the methodology that based on their past experience, they may also have their own methodology in terms of how they prioritize certain risks. So that's another important role where group operas team can play, is to ensure that we provide methodologies. And what we need to do is we need to provide different methodologies, because if they have an hour to make a particular decision, then they will need to use a very different methodology to identify and prioritize their risk than if they have 3 months to make some decision. And this is where I think most group operas team, they've just created one methodology, and then everybody is forced to use that one methodology. But if we want first line to be able to manage risk as part of the day-to-day activities, then we may have to give them different methodologies for different business situations, and we'll cover more on that later in this session. And then what we need to watch out for is we need to watch out for any heads of the business unit or departments where they are trying to game the system. So if they are intentionally cutting down investment on value protection, so they're cutting down controls because they want to then allocate more money towards sales and revenue and marketing, and that is not good for the organization in the medium to long term, then we need to make sure we catch those senior executives and we challenge them if we see that if the ratio of value creation, value protection was 60-40, and now a new senior executive comes in and they change that ratio. So they say 90% of their budget will be allocated to value creation and value protection will only be 10% of the budget, then that may be okay for the senior executive, but it may not be okay for the organization. And that's where the group risk team will need to play its challenger role, where that ratio between value creation and value protection, starts going in a difficult direction for the medium to long term. And this is how we then can bring all of this together. So on the left hand side, an organization defines its strategy, they cascade down the strategic objectives to the different departments, and then those strategic objectives will get aligned with the personal performance objectives of the key individuals. And then we align the compensation with those personal objectives. And once that is done, then on the day-to-day basis, what the first line is doing is they're making decisions in terms of launching new products. They may be making decision to stop selling a certain product. They may be making decisions to upgrade a certain system. And each of those decisions may expose organization to different types of risks. And then to implement those decisions, they will be executing various actions. So these may be just individual actions, or they may be a program or a project they may be executing. And of course, those actions would also expose organization to risk. And depending on those decisions they are making on the day-to-day basis, and the actions and the outcome of those actions, whether they are successful or not, the organization will find out whether they are able to achieve their objectives or not. So you get the actual performance, and then based on the actual performance, you can determine whether the individuals are able to meet the performance objectives. So whether we were able to increase our revenue by 16%, or we were not able to increase our revenue by 16%. Yeah. So what we need to do is, it's that decision and action, and how the budgets and the resources are being allocated between value creation and value protection. That becomes then the key playing ground for the operational risk team. That how do we then embed management of operational risk into that part of the day-to-day execution of the organization. And this is where then the risks come out from. So depending on what strategy selected by the organization, so if one organization says they want to grow their revenues by 40%, then they will have to take very different set of risks than if an organization says they want to grow the revenue by 5%. So depending on what strategy is selected by the organization, that may expose organization to new operational risk, or it may change the level of operational risk. Then how we align the strategic objectives with the individual performance objectives, and then how we align the compensation structure. So that may influence the risk taking and conduct risks within the business, or within the profile of a particular business. And the decisions and the actions being taken, they may also then either introduce new risks within the organization, or they may change the level of risk exposure of existing risks. Okay, and then those become the key plug points for the operational risk teams to make sure that how do we now embed adequate tools and practices within these areas, so that risk management or managing operational risk becomes part of those key activities where those risk-taking decisions are being taken. And this then summarizes this particular section, where from an organization perspective, we have organization objectives, organizational risk, and an organization also has its risk appetite. On the personal side, what is motivating individual is, what are their performance objectives, or what will they get measured on, and then they will assess their risks based on those objectives and what they need to do during the year. And then each individuals, they also have their personal risk appetite, which may drive how much risk they may be willing to take or not willing to take. And the compensation structure becomes the glue which aligns what the organization want, what the individuals will be doing from the day-to-day basis. And then we just want to recognize that these are the drivers of motivation. So how can we plug in the operational risk management practices into these areas, so that they see management of operational risk as part of something they need to do as part of the daily activity, rather than once a quarter or once a year when they get the request to perform an RCSA. So what are the areas where the first line may need help from the second line? So one of the points I wanted to bring where the operational risk team will need to help the first line is where they don't have visibility on all the risks. So it is very common that some of the processes for a first line may sit within the same department or the same business unit, but a lot of the processes they are relying on to execute their value creation activities or the value creation processes may sit in other departments. So they may be dependent on processes and activities within IT, finance, information security, and the first line within retail bank, they may not have the adequate amount of exposure on how the IT, the finance, the information security team is managing the risks. Because if they are not managing the risk correctly, then even though the retail banking may be doing a great job, if IT, finance, and other other departments, which also which they are dependent on, if they are not managing the risk correctly, then the retail banking, will not be successful in achieving their particular objective. So this is where the group operational risk teams, have a key role to play, because the group operational risk team then has visibility over the different departments, and how do we then expose the risks or the controls which may be influencing the processes or the day-to-day activities within the first line. And this is where, if you are just using Excel, then it may become very difficult for you to get a complete picture. So this is where using some GRC software or operational risk software, where you can document these processes, you can document the risks and controls across the different business units, and then you can create those linkages so that the head of retail banking can see that in order for them to be successful, they're reliant on 10 controls in IT, they're reliant on 6 controls within finance, and 22 controls within information security. So it is very important for the group operational risk team, to facilitate that. How do we create that visibility? Because first line on its own may not have the power, or they may not have the motivation, or they may not even know, where do they go and talk to in order to find out who else should be managing their risks correctly, in order for them to be managing their risks appropriately. So that's one area where the group operational risk teams, will need to support the various first line, because they will not be able to do that on their own. So let's then divide the first line into 4 tiers. So let's slice and dice and see where do we need to focus on the first line if we need to embed the management of operational risk. So to facilitate this conversation, I have divided the first line stakeholders into 4 tiers. So the first tier is the senior executives, the board tier, where they're defining the future strategy of the organization, and they're making key decisions around how are we going to allocate our resources, our capital across the different strategic priorities. And they are the ones who are ultimately accountable on behalf of the firm to external stakeholders like shareholders and regulators. So let's put stakeholders like board and CEO and CFO and the senior executive team in tier 1. In tier 2, you have individuals who are the heads of the different divisions and departments. So they're the ones who define how strategy should be achieved through operational implementation plans within their business scope. So the head of insurance will then go about and then implement the strategy to achieve the objectives defined, for the insurance business. The head of retail bank, will then go and implement. They will allocate the budget depending on the priorities assigned to that particular business unit, and they are then making the decision on allocating the resources between the different operational priorities. So are they going to allocate budget towards upgrading a system or keeping it in-house? If there is a legacy system we've been using for 20 years, are they going to invest in moving to a more modern system, or are they deciding to continue to use that 20-year-old legacy system during the year because they may not see that as a important priority area for the year? So these are the executives who are then the heads of the different divisions or heads of the different business unit. And their operational plans may also include change management initiatives. So yeah, they have to keep running their day-to-day processes, but they are typically also they may also be made owner of specific change management initiatives, which they may have to execute within their parts of the organization. Then in tier three is where we have individuals who then embed the operational implementation plan into the day-to-day operations. So this is where you may have the head of the sales team within the retail banking team, or the head of all the retail banking branches. So we're talking about those individuals where they're much closer to the day-to-day activities, and they make the decisions on allocating resources to specific market segments, which type of products they will develop or stop selling in a given year. They may be making decisions on which processes do we need to automate or keep them as manual, or which processes we need to stop executing, we need to modify. And same with IT system, which skills and capabilities we need to develop, which third parties we need to work with, which business partners we may have to have a collaboration with in order to achieve the organizational objective. So they are then making those day-to-day tactical decisions, and they are involved in leading or implementing of entire or specific parts of the change management initiative. So if you have corporate-wide change management initiatives, then they may be playing a part, that they may be leading a certain work stream as part of those corporate initiatives, or they may be owning their own corporate initiatives. Their roles are most challenging of all the tiers because they need to be involved in planning. They also need to be involved in implementation. Plus, they also need to provide supervision on the day-to-day aspects, and they are also involved in the change management initiatives. So the executives, the managers in this tier, they are the most squeezed, because they're not only just making decisions, but they also have to get involved in the details. Plus, they also have to take a high-level perspective. And in tier four, then we have the individuals who are then actually doing the work. So they are executing those processes. So they are the branch sales staff, who are then talking to the customers to sell new mortgages or credit card products, the call center staff, which is responding to customer queries and so on. So those are the individuals who are then part of tier four, and they may also be involved in specific change management initiatives. So that, from a number perspective, so tier four will definitely make a bigger chunk in the organization in terms of number of individuals who may be involved in those tiers. So I wanted to break the first line stakeholders into these four tiers, because we need to adopt different strategy of how we embed and how we raise the awareness on operational risk across these different tiers. So if you look at each of these tiers, so in this case here we have columns in terms of what type of decisions are being made in each tier. What are the financial amounts, or how big are those decisions which are being made in each of those tiers? How influential the individuals within those tiers are on the organizational priorities, and how much influence do they have on potential risk exposure an organization may have to take on operational risk. Okay, so those are the four columns. So if we look at the first tier, so they are the individuals who are making the most significant strategic decisions for the firm, because the decisions they are making, it may impact the organization for multiple years. So they're not just making decisions for next week or next few months, but their decisions may impact the operational risk profile of the organization for many years. So that's a very important tier, and they're also important because they're the ones who are making these multi-million, maybe multi-billion pound decision. So if they're making decisions to acquire a bank, then those decisions can be significantly big decisions, and typically it's the individuals in tier one who would be making those type of merger and acquisition type decision. So of course their influence on the firm-wide strategic priorities is quite critical, because they are the ones who are deciding how the resources will be allocated between retail bank and the insurance business unit. And in terms of the risk exposure, their decisions can have significant level of impact on the firm level risk exposure. Some of their decisions can also have significant level of impact on business unit and department level risk exposure. So if they decide that investment banking is something which is no longer important, for the organization, that they're cutting down the amount of activities being done on investment banking, then that may have a significant level of impact on the risk exposure of the investment banking business unit. Yeah. So while their decisions may have an impact on the whole firm, some of the decisions may also impact specific business unit or divisions. Then in tier two, they are making the significant strategic decisions, but only for their business scope. So their decisions may impact their business unit. So if the head of retail banking, they're making decisions which may impact the priorities of the retail banking business unit. They would also be making big decisions. So it'll probably be into your multi-million pound decisions, maybe billion pound in some large organizations where the division may be significantly big. And they are influencing strategic priorities of business unit through the allocation of resources, but only for their particular scope in the organization. Their decisions can have significant level of impact on the business unit level risk exposure. And this is where the central function can play an important role, because in tier two, for example, head of IT would also fall in tier two. And because IT then is a central function, the decisions they make can have a significant level of impact on the risks of the frontline business unit. So if the head of IT decides that they are not going to upgrade a system which we've been using for 20 years and we will continue to use that system for another 12 months, they decide they're not going to allocate any IT budget to upgrade that system, then the frontline business unit will have to deal with the risks associated with those decisions taken by the head of IT. So that's where you may have to segregate that tier two between the frontline and the central functions. Then in tier three, which is where we are talking about the heads of specific teams, then they're making operational decisions, but again for their own specific departments. Their decisions may be into a lower sort of millions. For example, upgrading IT system, or by spending 1.2 million. They are influencing more the operational priorities of their own department on how they decide to allocate their resources. And their decisions can have significant level of impact on the department level risk exposures. And similarly, if tier three, so within IT, if there was a team for managing, let's say, mobile banking application, then the head of that mobile banking application team, depending on what decisions they make, the frontline business unit may again be exposed to certain risks of those tier three executives in the central function. Then you have tier four. So these are then the individuals who are sort of doing the day-to-day activities. So they're making the tactical decisions, and they may be making some decisions, but the financial amounts related to that decision would be low, and they may not have that much influence on risk taking, but they definitely can provide a lot of feedback because they're very close to those day-to-day activities. They're close to customers. So while their individual activities may not be exposing organization to a lot of risk, they definitely will have a lot of valuable feedback, and we want to see how we collect that feedback to make our risk-related decisions better over medium to long term. So their decisions can sometimes have minimal impact on the team or the department level, and in the central function also, where there may be minimal impact on the business unit or department level risk exposure. So that sort of is one way to look at what are the different priorities for the executives in these different tiers, so we can then determine how do we embed the operational risk management activities for individuals across these tiers. So then we stick with those 4 tiers, and then we have 3 more columns here. So who can play the key role in terms of influencing the risk management thinking for individuals within these different tiers? What do we need to consider in terms of integrating management of risk, and which of the individuals have the most level of influence on integrating management of operational risk as part of the day-to-day activity? So in case of tier 1, and in case of tier 1, the chief risk officer and the head of op risk, so they need to play the key role to ensure that risk management is considered as a strategic priority for the organization, and risk management is not just treated as a compliance activity by the board and the senior executives. So they are sort of the main salespeople to ensure that senior executives and the board understand, and they are allocating adequate resources for management of operational risk within the organization. And integrating integration of management of operational risk, they need to embed that into the strategy definition process, any strategic planning process, and any key strategic decisions which are happening at that tier 1 level. Then the chief risk officer and the head of op risk, they need to make sure that consideration of operational risk is part of those activities. And then the level of influence the tier 1 individuals will have is high on how much, because they're not operating on the day-to-day level, right? So that's where more tier 2 and tier 3, they're more operating on the day-to-day level, so they have a much higher influence on how operational risk may be integrated from a day-to-day perspective than the tier 1 executives. So in tier 2, also the CRO, head of op risk, play a key part to make sure that the individuals in tier 2 understand the importance and relevance of managing operational risk, and management of operational risk needs to be embedded within the operational implementation planning, any key decisions which are being made, and any change management initiatives those divisions may be executing. And tier 2 executives then play a very important part, because they are the ones then who operationalize the strategy of the organization. So how they make the decision in terms of priorities becomes a key driver of how operational risks may be managed as part of the day-to-day activities. Then for tier 3 executives, so that's where the head of op risk will have to play a key role. So the chief risk officer will sort of deal with the senior executives, and tier 3, the head of op risk, may have to play that influencing role. And then if for larger operational risk teams, if you have dedicated operational risk individuals in the second line, so if you have a dedicated person who sort of liaises with the retail bank on behalf of the group operational risk team, or a dedicated person who liaises on behalf of the operational risk team with the insurance team, then those individuals play a key role to make sure that the right things are happening on a day-to-day perspective. And in this case, the management of risk needs to be embedded within the operational decision making, the day-to-day operations, and any change management initiatives which are being executed in those different departments. And tier 3 executives also are very, very influential, and that's why we want to ensure that they are also on board, because if they are not communicating and doing the right things, then of course the tier 4 are not going to be doing the right things in terms of managing operational risk as part of their day-to-day activities. And for the tier 4 individuals, it's then the operational risk team members who are then aligned with specific business areas. They're the ones who will be interacting on a day-to-day basis, and they need to ensure then that management of risk is part of the day-to-day operations and any change management which are being executed at those team levels. But they have very little influence on embedding how management of operational risk is embedded into the day-to-day activity. So the key stakeholders are the tier 2 and the tier 3 executives, that they need to understand why management of operational risk is relevant and important. And then we've highlighted the areas where we want to embed the management of operational risk. And if they are on board, then the job becomes much easier. If those tier 2, tier 3 senior executives, if they are not on board and they just see operational risk as a painful activity or just as a compliance activity, then it becomes very difficult to embed management of operational risk as part of the day-to-day processes. And this is how we can then visualize what this may look like. So you'll have your tier 1, which is your board committee, senior executives, any executive committees will become your tier 1 stakeholders. Then if you take a specific business unit, so this may be retail bank, where you may then have the senior executives of the retail bank, and then retail bank may have its own set of risk committees, compensation committees, and so on. So they will be your tier 2 stakeholders. Then each business unit may have a department. So your tier 3 will then be the senior managers within that particular department. And then your tier 4s are then the individual employees who are then executing the day-to-day activities. And then if you have a different department, then you have different set of individuals in tier 3 and tier 4. And then if you have a multiple business unit, then this is how it may look sort of visually, where you'll have different set of stakeholders in tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. And if you have corporate functions or support functions, then they also have their own tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 stakeholders. And where you have multiple corporate functions, then they are then serving the frontline business unit. And yeah, so this is a simple example, but it looks complex. So in real life, of course, this is very complicated, trying to get a map of who these different stakeholders are. But hopefully with this structure of dividing between tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, what you can start doing is for each of the different frontline and support functions, at least identify who are the key stakeholders you need to get on board, so that you can then start creating some activities or initiatives to make them realize the importance of managing operational risk on part of day-to-day basis. It allows you to identify who those stakeholders should be, and then you want to focus on the tier 2 and the tier 3, that those are the two most important group of stakeholders from operational risk management perspective. Okay, so then let's look at what is involved in terms of integrating risk management into core activities. So I've divided these into different sections. So first, we need to look at the why. So why would somebody in the first line want to manage operational risk as part of the day-to-day activity? So we need to give them some incentives, some motivation. Once they have the motivation, we need to give them the skills, because yeah, if they know that it's important, but if they don't have the skills, then they will not be able to manage operational risk as part of their activities. And then once they have the skill, we need to give them some tools so that they can manage risk in a structured way on the day-to-day basis, so they're not completely dependent on the operational risk team in terms of managing the operational risk on the day-to-day basis. And if they are new to learning about operational risk management, then you may have to take them on a learning journey, because it may take a few months for them to learn and practice the tools and the skills so that it becomes very natural for them to apply management of operational risk on the day-to-day basis. And we need to give them adequate amount of resources. So if managing operational risk in Excel becomes very difficult, then you may have to give them some resources in terms of software, so that the amount of time they have to spend on managing, documenting risk can be reduced, so they can then spend more time on value creation activities. And then we need to look at what are the different integration points, so that management of operational risk sort of becomes mandatory, that it's not optional. You cannot skip management of operational risk as part of those activities. So that's what we'll cover as part of that integration point. So we'll drill down. So let's look into each one of these sections. So in this first section, we want to look at the why. So we want to make sure that, first of all, there is that motivation for first line to manage risk as part of the day-to-day activities. So in this case, the best recommendation, from all the research, is that you want to make decision-making and management of risk as core capability for every team leader, manager, and senior executive within your organization. Yeah, because you already would have a set of core capabilities. So for example, if you need to be in retail bank, then you need to have some retail banking experience. If you are a senior executive, you need to have experience on managing profit and loss account. You need experience on managing people. You may need experience on negotiating, managing stakeholders. So like you already have those different capabilities, which you select your senior executives and team leaders on, you want to add decision making and management of risk as two more capabilities to every team leader, manager, and senior executive role. This way, they need to know. This will then make it very transparent for them that if they want to be successful within the organization, then they need to proactively develop the decision-making ability, and they need to demonstrate that they are managing risk as part of the day-to-day activity. And I'll show you later on examples where we did a research on LinkedIn to see how many first-line job descriptions which were advertised on LinkedIn were referencing decision-making or management of risk as core capability. Because if it's part of their job responsibilities, if it's part of the job description or the capabilities they need to be successful, then it becomes there is no escape. Then that they need to demonstrate that they're also good at making decisions, and they're also good at managing operational risk if they want to be successful within an organization. And then you can also make this as part of any promotion or any hiring. So if you hire anybody, then you're also evaluating them, that you get them to demonstrate, okay, give us an example of a good business decision you've made in the last 3 years, or give us an example of you made a good decision, but the outcome of that decision were not good. So you want to evaluate them on how they make business decision, because management of risk is inherent part of how senior executives make those decisions. So if we evaluate those as part of all the promotion, as part of all the hiring, then it gives them the motivation to make sure that they demonstrate progress in those capabilities if they want to be successful in the organization. And then you also want to embed this as part of the performance evaluation methodologies for every team leader, manager, senior executives. You may want to communicate them of why it's important, for them to be a good decision maker and management to manage a particular risk, because the business environments we're all dealing within are very volatile. There are lots of uncertainties. There are a lot of complex scenarios we have to deal with, and also there's a lot of ambiguity in the day-to-day operational and business environment. So managing risk and being able to make good decision is important for them to just manage their day-to-day business activities and the day-to-day business strategy. And in this case, if we are able to demonstrate any internal case studies where a senior executive followed a structured process to make a particular decision, and that decision turned out to be successful, then we can create those case studies, or other senior executives may also learn from that. So if you find that a particular team or a particular department is really good at managing their risk as part of the day-to-day activities, then publishing that as a case study so other departments and teams can also learn from those case studies will also help. And the board and senior executives, can play a key role here, that if they demonstrate that in order for somebody to be successful in the organization, yes, they need to have people management skills, retail banking skills, negotiation skills, but they also need to have decision-making skills, and they also need to have skills on managing risks as part of their day-to-day activity. Then it gives a lot more credibility if the board and the senior executives also communicate that those capabilities are important for you to be successful in the organization. So those are the aspects we can use to create that motivation of why people would care. And the easiest way is to make sure it's part of those job descriptions, because if it's not part of job description, then it becomes an add-on activity, and then it's very difficult to convince somebody on something they should be doing if it's not explicitly listed as part of their job responsibilities. Then if we have that motivation, then we need to give them the skills. So they'll need to know, how do I manage operational risk as part of my day-to-day activity? So this is where I've listed down different bullet points of skills you may have to develop. So you may have to create specific courses within your organization, and these may be classroom type courses. These may be online video recordings of the courses where you communicate how can they make good quality decisions? How can they make risk-informed decisions? How can they identify risk in different contexts? If they're thinking of launching a new product, what process can they follow to identify the relevant risks related to their new product? If they're thinking of outsourcing a key business process to an external vendor, then what process can they go through to identify the relevant risks for that particular business example? So I've highlighted the different topics where the group operational risk team will need to make sure that you are providing constant training courses and learning to the first line individuals, so that individuals who are motivated enough and now they need the skills, you take them in the next step on the journey. So you show them how it is done, so they don't have to then come to operational risk team if they want to identify the risks associated with launching a new product, for example. Once we have given them the skills so they know how they can do it, we also need to give them some tools. And this is where I've seen that in some organizations, when you have to identify risk, you get people together and then you start with, oh, what keeps you awake at night? And that is a very poor way, of identifying risk. So what we want to do is we want to give various tools so that first line, when they are considering and thinking about risk, those tools can make it easy for them to identify the risk. Those tools can make them easy to assess the risk, so they're not starting from a blank piece of paper. Because if they have to start from a blank piece of paper, then it becomes hard work, and if it's hard work, then the motivation sort of goes down. But if we can give them tools, saying, okay, these are some of the tools that if you are launching product, then maybe this tool is better for you to identify the relevant risk. If you're thinking of outsourcing a particular IT system or a process, then here is a tool you can use to identify the risks relevant to that particular business situation. Then it becomes much easier that they can then identify and manage the risk in a lot more structured way. And you'll need to give a library of tools, right? So you can't just give one tool for everybody. So depending on what different first line business units are doing, you may have to then create different tools, and also apply the different context, that if they have only 1 hour to do something, then the tool should be easy to apply the tool in 1 hour. If they have 6 months, then the tool can be a little bit more comprehensive. So you don't want just one tool for a 6 month business situation and a 1 hour business situation. Okay. So I've given examples of some of the tools here. If you Google on those, you'll find lots of examples of how you can apply those particular tools. And we may have to, you may have to build those tools and then train the different first line users on those tools so they know when to utilize a specific tool in their business situation. Then once we've given them the skills, once we've given them the tools, so now they will start applying those tools and skills into their day-to-day work. And that's where you need to help them on their learning journey. So you will have to facilitate the collaboration, because when after they've done the training course, you've given them the tool, and if they go back into their department, and one of the first things they need to work on is looking at the risks associated with the new product they are thinking of launching, then they will try to apply those concepts we've trained them on that situation. And it'll be difficult for them for the first 2 or 3 times, because it's difficult to apply a concept straight away in the first situation. And that's where you want to support them, that you may have to give them some hand holding. You may have to have some people they can call back on or email if they get stuck, saying, oh, I tried to apply this tool in this situation, and I don't think we identified all the right risks. So where did I go wrong? That you may have to give them that hand holding while they're applying those techniques, for the first 2 or 3 times. And this is where, if you can share any case studies that, okay, you went and applied this tool in this context, and this is what worked, this is what didn't work. If we can publish those case studies, so other people who may be trying to apply the same tools in different contexts can also learn from each other. Then we have the success from learning communities that should be documented and widely shared as much as possible, so that we also build that collective knowledge across the different departments and teams. The failures from the learning community should also be evaluated, so we can identify learning opportunities which can be documented and also widely shared. And then there should be some expert available, to those members, so that if they have questions, they can call somebody either in the group operational risk team, or if you have a separate learning team which is facilitating this particular capability, then they should be able to call on somebody while it's all new to them, and they're trying the best to apply these concepts. And then you need to give them adequate time to apply the learning and develop the capability. So it may take them 6 to 12 months to really absorb all those tools, all the skills, and for them to become independent, that they will now be able to start thinking about risk as part of the day-to-day process without requiring a lot of hand-holding and support from the group operational risk team. So we just need a little bit of patience on that learning journey, and support them on that learning journey. So group operational risk team, initially you may have to provide a lot of hand holding, but hopefully that should go down over a period of time if we execute this particular initiative effectively. And then we need to provide them resources. So they may want to do it. They have the skills, they have the capabilities, but if we don't give them the right resources, if we don't, give them adequate time, if they don't have the right software, if they don't know how to apply, so if they don't have success stories on what has worked, what has not worked, we may have to give them some books in case they want to read more about those particular topics. We may have to expose them to industry best practices from standards like ISO 31000, COSO ERM, and we may have to do regular classroom and webinar sessions for them so that we keep reinforcing. So you don't want to just do one training and then leave them to implement it. You may have to do like a refresher course every 3 months so that if they forget some of those concepts, we can bring those concepts back up, and then as they get more experience in implementing some of these ideas, they may have more questions, and we can then improve their knowledge as part of that frequent learning cycle. So the group operational risk team needs to make sure that you're investing, then providing them the adequate resources. And then the last aspect is, where can we make this mandatory? So it's not optional. So there are various points I have listed down here where if you make consideration of operational risk as part of those process, then there is no option. There is no way you cannot think about operational risk. So if we have the strategic definition and planning process, if the senior executives, they get together in September or October every year and they're thinking about the strategy for the next year, if they're following a certain process or they capture details in a specific template, then how do you make consideration of operational risk as part of that strategic process? Because then if it is part of that, then when they're thinking about the strategy for the next year, they will automatically think about the operational risk. But if there are no pointers in that meeting or in the templates they are using, then of course they may not think about operational risk as part of that. Similarly, any big decisions which are being made. So in most organizations, when you have to make a decision, you have to go to some committee and you have to present a business case where you may have to, Excel or Word or PowerPoint, you have to present a business case to this committee, and then they decide whether you get the budget to execute that decision or not. So we want to look at the template which is being used to make those decisions and see how we embed consideration of operational risk as part of those templates. So if you have to go in front of a group outsourcing committee to get approval for outsourcing a particular process, and there is a Word document you have to fill in to demonstrate the business case for outsourcing, then there should be one section in that Word document for management of operational risk. And they have to fill that out, and then we need to train the committee members that they need to make sure that they give adequate attention to that operational risk section, and they challenge the person who's presenting the business case to ensure they have adequately thought about the operational risk in a structured way before making that decision. Okay, so these are the different aspects I have mentioned. I'm not going to go into each of these bullet points, but these are all the different activities which are happening in your organization already. So what you need to do is you need to find out if there are any standard templates, any standard document, any standard process which is being used, and how can management of operational risk be made as part of those decisions and as part of those processes. Then in this case, what we look at is we look at the different levels. So how mature an organization may be in terms of its risk management capability. So let's start with level 0. So there will be some individuals, or hopefully a very minor few individuals, who understand the importance of managing risk, but they only apply this for personal gains. Even if they know that they may be taking a risk which may be okay for them and personally good for them, but that risk taking is not good for the organization over the medium to long term. So these are sort of the rogue, malicious people. So if you identify them, you fire them ASAP because their interests are not aligned with the interest of the organization. Then At level 1, you may have individuals in the first line who are ignorant about managing risk, and they do not even think about risk as part of their day-to-day activity. They just come in, they do the daily work, and they have no idea what risk is. They have not done any risk management training. They don't even talk or think about risk as part of the day-to-day activity. So if you have individuals like that in your first line, then sort of we can classify them as level 1. And what we need to do is, for these individuals, we need to provide them training, and we need to give them incentives of why they should be thinking about risk as part of their day-to-day activities. So that's what we need to do as the group operational risk team, to make sure that they're thinking about the risk as part of their day-to-day activities. Then on level 2, you will have individuals who understand the importance of managing risk from a theoretical perspective, but they don't know how to apply it. So they may have attended courses, they may know that risk management is good, but they don't know how to do it. So in this case, what you want to do is you want to identify those individuals and make sure we're providing them training courses, we give them the right tools, the skills, so that they can actually start applying the risk management thinking as part of their day-to-day activity. Then on level 3, you would have some individuals who understand the importance of managing risk, but they only apply this on an ad hoc basis. So they'll apply it in some cases, but they won't apply it in other cases. But they understand that managing risk is important. So in this case, we need to give them training, and we need to give them incentive that they should be looking at risk as part of all their key activities. That if they're executing 10 activities, they can't just be doing that for 2 activities, and then 8 activities they're not thinking about risks at all. So in this case, we need to give them training, we need to give them incentives, so they apply that on a consistent basis on their day-to-day activities. Then in level 4, you will have individuals who understand the importance of managing risk, but they are unable to apply this due to resource constraints. So they just don't have time, that they have so much on their plate, there is just no time to think about risk at all. Or they don't have the budget that they want to hire. They want to hire somebody who can help them come and extend the risk management thinking or apply risk management on their day-to-day process, but they're just not able to get budget, to hire an additional person who can help them with that risk analysis. So for these individuals, we need to help them support their business case. So how can they get additional time? How can they get additional budget so that they can implement and apply that risk management thinking in their day-to-day activities? Then on level 5, you will have individuals who understand the importance of managing risk, but they do not get support from their colleagues or managers to apply this in a consistent manner on their day-to-day activities. So they may want to do it, but their manager doesn't want to do it. So the manager may see thinking about risk as a waste of time, or their colleagues may not be supportive. And in this case, we want to provide training and incentives to manage the risk as part of the business unit. So we may have to then not only tackle individuals, but we may actually have to look at that whole department or that whole team how do we create training awareness within that team on why risk management is important, and have some incentive at the department and the team level, so that it's not just 1 or 2 individuals who understand it, but all the key individuals within that business unit or department understand that, so it can be then managed as a team in that particular business area. And then on level 6 is where you have individuals who understand the importance of managing risk, and then they consistently apply this in all the day-to-day activities. And then colleagues and managers also fully support consistent application of risk management. So that sort of is the nirvana, we're all trying to get to, where it'll be great to have everybody in the first line on level 6. And that's where if there are, and in every organization, there will be a few individuals already on level 6. So if you're able to identify those level 6 individuals, then we want to recognize them, and we want to reward them and support them in any way possible, and then present them as a role model, for the rest of the firm. If we are able to identify, a small group of individuals in our organization who are on level 6. So that gives you an idea of where different individuals in your first line, maybe because they're all at different level of maturity in terms of thinking about risk and applying risk on the day-to-day basis. So what you can do is you can use this to see if you had 1,000 employees in your bank, what would be the breakdown of those employees, and then that will give you focus areas where you can target that. If you have a lot of people in level 2 or level 3, then you know that training is what you need to do, where you need to then have a setup of training courses over 3 to 6 months, so you bring them up the maturity curve. Okay, and then the next few slides will just talk about different scenarios where we take this capability. So in this case, I am taking understanding the key concepts for managing risk, the practical experience first line may have in managing the risk. Are they actually applying the management of risk in their day-to-day activities? Are they applying this to all the activities or only some activities? Then we have support from managers and team members. So do they get that support? Do they get support from board and senior executives? Are there any resource constraints they face in managing risks in their day-to-day activities? And then how does first line perceive operational risk processes within an organization? So we sort of look at that criteria, and then this becomes like the first situation where an organization will be in this situation, can be classified as fulfill minimal regulatory requirements. So in this organization, you have first line, they do not have the right skills for managing risk. First line does not have the experience to manage risk as part of their day-to-day activities. First line does not apply managing risk as part of their day-to-day activities, so they don't have experience and they don't do it. And first line, they apply managing risk to activities, but only to fulfill certain compliance obligations. So they're not really managing risk to make their processes better. They just want to get the tick in the boxes from a compliance perspective. The managers and the team members, they say the right things, but they don't act when it matters. The board and the senior executives also say the right things, but they do not act when it matters. And very minimal resources are assigned for managing risk, and then mainly risk management is treated as they're just given enough resources to fulfill the basic compliance obligation. And in such organization, operational risk is perceived as just a compliance activity. Yeah. And this is where you may have, your group op risk department may just be, one FTE or even less in some organizations. The risk team may be really small. And this is a common sort of state, at least from my experience in small branches of foreign firms, in UK and in smaller firms. And firms in this category are basically relying on luck as their strategy, because they're not looking at managing risk, as part of their core activity. So it's only a matter of time before things go wrong, and these organizations, have to face and deal with severe issues. And that's what the next few slides then just highlight. So this is probably the most common one, where the scenario is frustrated op risk teams, where if I start on the left top side again, where majority of the first line does not have skills required for managing risk. So some have, but most don't. Majority of the first line does not have experience in managing risk as part of their day-to-day activities. Majority of the first line does not apply managing risk to day-to-day activities. So they don't have experience and they're not applying it. And they're again applying it, but only where it is a mandatory requirement. So if new product approval requires them to document the risks related to that product, they'll do it. But wherever it's not mandatory, they will ignore and not think about risks in those cases. Again, the managers and the board members in these organizations, they're saying the right things, but they don't act when it matters. Resources are available or can be provided, but there is no demand from the first line. So the group op risk team may be ready to help, but the first line doesn't care. They don't want help. They want to keep op risk team as far away as possible. And in these organizations, op risk processes are perceived to be complex, to be applied to the day-to-day activities. So they may think like, if I apply this inherent and residual risk assessment to the risks I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, it'll take me, it'll just make everything in my day-to-day process longer and complex. So they think whatever frameworks or processes have been created by the operational risk team, they're just not practical to apply on a day-to-day perspective. And in such organization, op risk is perceived as that it is satisfying the senior executives. So they just hoover all the data from the first line, they produce a lot of reports, and then they present it to the risk committee, the regulators, and the board. So the job of operational risk team is to satisfy the senior executives and not necessarily help the first line to improve their day-to-day processes better. And in my experience, this is where majority of the organizations are at this stage, where there's just not enough awareness, there's not enough skills, not the right tools have not been provided, or the board and the senior executives, they're not supporting the mandate. So when that support is needed, that support is not there, and it becomes very difficult in such organizations then to convince first line on why they should be managing risk as part of their day-to-day activity. And then this is the nirvana state, where this is where we would ideally want to get to, where everyone in the first line has skills required for managing risk. Everyone in the first line has experience for managing risk as part of the day-to-day activities. Everyone in the first line is applying risk as part of the day-to-day activities. Everyone in the first line applies managing risk to all their key decisions and actions. All managers and team members, they fully support management of risk and reinforce this through their actions. All board members, senior executives also support management of risk and reinforce this through their actions. There are adequate resources provided for managing risk. And in such organization, op risk processes are perceived to be aligned with industry best practices. They are practical and they are effective for managing risks in the day-to-day activities. Yeah, and that sort of is our mission, is to get to from this state of frustrated op risk teams where we've been trying for 10, 12, 13 years to embed this, but we have not been able to do, is how do we get to this state where it's all embedded within the first line. But we need to sort of go through that journey we talked about earlier in terms of capabilities, giving them the tools, giving them the skills, building those community for learning how to apply this, giving them the resources, and so on. Okay, and then there is the islands of hope, where so this may also be common in a few organizations where there may be some business unit who are really good at it, and some most other business units are not. So you may have those islands of hope, within your organization, and that's what this particular scenario is representing. So let me just do this last section, and then please do post your questions so we can take some questions. But like last time, I will take those questions on the LinkedIn group, and we can continue the discussion on the LinkedIn group. So I just want to finish on this last topic, where we went to LinkedIn and we took some job descriptions of jobs which were advertised for first line, because one of the things we are saying, if you want management of operational risk to be part of the day-to-day activity, is we need to have operational risk as part of the job description. So here are some examples. So in this case, Starling Bank was recruiting head of retail banking, and this were the requirements they published, and there's absolutely no mention of decision making or management risk. So this is a very poor example of an organization where management of risk is not considered as a core activity, even for a head of a retail bank. Then this is from HSBC, where global head of digital delivery pipeline. Again, no reference to management of risk. So they're looking for leadership. They're looking for experience with managing complex enterprise, managing budgets of more than 100 million, but no mention of risk at all. Then you have this, which is retail banking head based in Laos. And let me just move my, sorry, I just want to move my. Okay, so in this case, you can see understanding basic credit risk requirement and be prepared to learn on the job. So that is the only reference they have for retail banking head. So no mention of operational risk in this case. And then the next one is from customer experience and strategy manager. So in this case, yeah, they did not give the name of the bank, but again, there is no reference to management of risks or management of operational risk. So it is, by looking at this, you can then sort of assess that, okay, how important they are considering the risk management capability, that if they're hiring these senior managers, senior executives, and management of risk is not even part of the description, then of course management of risk is not going to be part of the day-to-day DNA within the organization. So let's continue and see if we can find some good examples. So then we have the next one was commodities trading ops. They were looking for AVP at Morgan Stanley. So there was some references here in the job description. So they said, yeah, you can identify right levels of controls and measures. So at least some reference to operational risk, but it's very controls focused. So even the next one, you actively ensure existence of mitigating controls. You can combine clear and appropriate escalation with suggestions on appropriate risk reduction strategies. So better than the previous examples, but not fully adequate. So there are still gaps where it's more controls focused rather than risk focused. Then this was the communications and campaign support officer at HSBC. So again, no reference to operational risk. Again, and that's quite an important role. The next one is client onboarding management for asset management at JP Morgan Chase. So in this case, there was a reference, a strong risk and control mindset that is detail oriented. So some hope here. At least they're talking about that, yeah, you need to sort of be thinking the risk and control mindset. So they're looking for somebody where they treat risk as part of their day-to-day activity. The next one, again, yeah, no mention of operational risk in this example. So here's the one from HSBC, customer services delivery head. So there are references to identify and manage operational and reputational risk. So they're explicitly now referring to operational risk that when they hire, they're going to evaluate that person on that particular requirement. And then the last one is knowledge of operational risk management, analytics, performance management. So this is fantastic that at least there is some reference. So the operational risk is important in this organization, at least in this particular first line role. And then here is the last one, EMEA third-party program management, where there was reference to internal controls and risk management in a global banking, experience in internal controls and risk management in global banking, financial services, and then basic understanding of outsourcing and third-party risk, because this role is related to third-party risk management. Okay, so this is one of the tools we need to do, is that if operational risk is not part of these requirements or job descriptions for hiring and promoting individuals within an organization, then of course we're not going to evaluate the people in those roles. They may not consider operational risk, as an important thing. But if these are embedded within these requirements for those specific first line roles, then it communicates something about the culture of that organization, that they treat operational risk management as a core capability, and it's not something on the side. So this is where I want to show you an example, because there was a good example from HSBC, but it was too long to bring on the slide. So let me see if I can show that example. Okay, so this is the Word document. I'll send this via email, where they were looking for global head of digital, commercial, and strategic planning. And it's a really long, really long job description. But so I'll scroll to the right part where they're referring to risk. So here they actually have a whole section in that job description around operational effectiveness and control, where they've highlighted various set of experiences they're looking for in this first line role. And this is a first line role, not a second line role they're hiring for. So they need capabilities there for identifying risks, issues, mitigation strategies, supporting audit, operational reputational risks, deployment of best practices, work with the operational risk team. So there's a lot of references here, which shows that this is important in HSBC for this particular role. And then they have a separate section just for management of risk, where they've also then highlighted more details around that. So that also communicates that they are treating management of risk as an important part of the role. And then there's also another section on just managing control. So that's also then important from a operational risk management perspective. So that is probably one of the best examples I've seen so far, where as part of the job description, they are communicating that, yeah, you need experience in retail banking and managing budget, managing people, but we also need people with experience in controls and reputational risk and operational risk management. Okay, so that was the last part I wanted to cover, and then we'll continue with the rest of the slides in the next session, where we're going to be focusing mainly around decision making. So we've identified that if we want operational risk management to be embedded in that first line activities, then they are making decisions, and how do we embed management of operational risk as part of this decision. So that's what we're going to cover in a lot more detail in the next session. So we will continue the dialogue on the LinkedIn group. So if you've not already joined the group, then the group where we can continue the dialogue is Operational Risk, Emerging Topics and Learnings. So that's where I had posted the questions from the last session. Okay, so here's the trail where we have questions from the last session. So if you want to go and look at those questions, and I will look at the questions, any questions which have come out from the session today, and we can then continue the discussion on that LinkedIn group. Okay. So I'll stop here. If you have any questions, you can ping that to me now. Happy to answer that, or we can continue the discussion on the LinkedIn group. And as usual, I will send the recording of the slide, the presentation. So if you want to look at any of the parts separately, then you'll also have that possibility. Okay, so thank you very much. Then, yeah, for coming this session, I'll just stay online. I see people are dropping off. I'll just stay here in case there are any questions. Thank you very much for joining the second session.
Thank you. It was very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah.